There is a photograph taken in the early 1960s. Joan Kennedy standing beside her husband at some glittering Washington reception, draped in a pale silk sheath, her blonde hair set perfectly, her posture immaculate. She is, by any measure, luminous. She is smiling. And yet, if you study it long enough, something unsettling surfaces, because that smile is doing an enormous amount of work. It is holding something back. You can see it, once you know to look, in the way her hands are clasped just slightly too tightly, in the way her eyes are oriented not toward the camera, but somewhere just beside it, as though she is watching for a cue that never quite comes. Everyone knows the Kennedy name. The tragedies, the glamour, the myth of Camelot, that brief, glittering American fantasy that the family itself commissioned and the culture has never entirely stopped believing in. The assassinations, the plane crashes, the weight of a dynasty that seemed to attract catastrophe the way other families attract fortune. But buried underneath all of it is a woman whose story almost nobody tells. One who paid a price that almost nobody in that family ever had to pay, because her damage was not operatic. It was not sudden. It did not make the front pages. It accumulated quietly over decades in the background of other people's history. Her name was Joan Bennett Kennedy. And what happened to her was not an accident. It was a consequence. This channel is trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month. 1,000 people who believe that stories like this one deserve to be told carefully. Told honestly, told the way history actually felt. If this is the kind of story you came here for, hitting that subscribe button right now would mean more than you know. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to what we're building here. Now back to where we were, because what happened next changes everything. Chapter 1. The Innocent Before. She was born in 1936 in Bronxville, New York, into the particular kind of upper-middle-class American household where appearances were not merely maintained, but constituted a kind of moral framework. Harry Bennett was an advertising executive. Virginia Joan Bennett, Joan to everyone, grew up in a world of country clubs and church on Sundays, of lessons and social obligations, of the understood requirement that a well-raised girl should be, above all, presentable. It was the kind of household where feelings were managed, not expressed. Where sensitivity was an aesthetic quality to be appreciated in music and art, not a psychological reality to be accommodated in daily life. Joan grew up beautiful, genuinely, almost disconcertingly beautiful, with the kind of blonde, fine-featured looks that stop conversations. She was also gentle and musical, with a real and serious talent for the piano that her teachers recognized as something beyond the ordinary accomplishments expected of young women of her background. She was sensitive, too. Sensitive in a way that sometimes felt at odds with the world she had been raised to perform for. Here's the thing about that sensitivity. It was not a weakness. It was, in fact, the most real thing about her. She felt music physically. She felt other people's distress as something that registered in her own body. She was the kind of person who noticed what was happening in a room before anyone had said a word. That quality, in a different life, in a different set of circumstances, might have been called a gift. It might have found a home in a profession, a vocation, a marriage to someone who recognized and protected it. But this was the 1950s, and the life that was being assembled for Joan Bennett, the life that her beauty and her background and her era were conspiring to produce, was not one that had been designed with sensitivity in mind. She attended Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in 1954. She was studying education. She was playing piano. She was, by all available accounts, happy, with the specific fragile happiness of someone who has not yet encountered the full weight of what the world intends for them. She had no idea. She couldn't have known what she was walking into. Chapter 2. The Golden Catalyst. She met Edward Kennedy in 1957. He was 25. She was 21. He had come to Manhattanville to visit his sister Jean, and Joan was there playing piano at a fashion show, which is the kind of occasion that, when you look back on it later, seems either like fate or like cruelty dressed up as fate. Ted Kennedy was charming. This is not a contested point. He had the Kennedy gift for making whoever he was speaking to feel, in that moment, like the most important person in the room. He was large and physical and warm, with the easy confidence of a man who had grown up understanding that the world was broadly arranged for his benefit. He pursued Joan with the same uncomplicated momentum he applied to most things he wanted. They were engaged within a year. Married in November 1958 at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Bronxville. The wedding was covered in the newspapers. She was 22 years old, and she was, by every external measure, stepping into a dream. But before we get to what happened inside that marriage, there is something crucial you need to understand about the world Joan had just entered. Something that would shape everything that followed. The Kennedys were not simply a family. They were an institution. They were a project. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had spent decades and an extraordinary amount of money constructing a political dynasty, and the infrastructure of that project, the image management, the press relationships, the internal culture of competitive performance and enforced loyalty, was already fully operational by the time Joan arrived. She did not marry a man. She was absorbed into a system. The women in that system occupied a specific and clearly defined role. They were decorative. They were supportive. They managed households and produced children, and appeared at the right events in the right clothes, and did not, under any circumstances, introduce complications. Joan was 22, sensitive, musical, and constitutionally unsuited to performing contentment she did not feel. The story of what came next is not simply a story about a difficult marriage. It is a story about a woman being slowly, systematically erased. Chapter 3: The Oppressive System. The Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port was, by the accounts of those who spent time there, a simultaneously exhilarating and exhausting place. The family operated at a pitch of competitive energy that was almost athletic in its intensity. Touch football on the lawn, sailing, dinner table debates conducted at a speed and volume that left outsiders feeling they had attended an event for which they had not been adequately prepared. The Kennedy siblings, Jack, Bobby, Ted, Eunice, Pat, Jean, had grown up inside this system and had been shaped by it, toughened by it, made fluent in its particular language of irony and toughness and performance. Joan had not grown up inside it. She arrived as an outsider, and the family, with the unconscious cruelty of institutions that do not know they are institutions, never entirely let her forget it. The other Kennedy women, Ethel Skakel Kennedy above all, had mastered the vocabulary. Ethel was loud and funny and physically fearless, a match for the family's energy in a way that generated approval and inclusion. Joan was quieter, more interior, given to reflection rather than performance. At family gatherings, she was sometimes described, by family members and observers, as being on the periphery, present but not quite integrated, smiling at conversations she had not been fully invited into. She tried. This is one of the things that makes the story so difficult to bear in retrospect. She tried with a consistency and earnestness that speaks precisely to the sensitivity that had always defined her. She learned to sail. She campaigned for Ted with a grace and articulateness that his advisors privately acknowledged was an electoral asset. She gave interviews. She wore the right clothes. She produced 3 children, Kara, Edward Jr., and Patrick, whom she loved with an intensity that everyone who knew her confirmed was entirely genuine. And Ted was unfaithful. Repeatedly, openly, in the way that powerful men of that era and that culture were permitted to be unfaithful, which is to say with the tacit understanding of everyone around them and the enforced silence of the women most directly affected. Joan knew. She has said so herself, in interviews given in later years with the careful, measured honesty of someone who has spent a long time deciding what she is willing to say out loud. She knew, and she had nowhere to put the knowledge, because the system she had married into did not provide a mechanism for a Kennedy wife to acknowledge that her marriage was in distress. The image required otherwise. So she did what the system required. She smiled. She appeared. She performed the contentment that was expected of her, with the technical skill of someone who had been performing for an audience since childhood. And she began, somewhere around the early 1960s, to drink. It is important to say this plainly and without euphemism, because the alternative, the soft pedaling, the implication rather than the statement, is its own kind of erasure. Joan Kennedy developed alcoholism. It was not a character failing. It was a consequence. Chapter 4: The Unraveling. There were miscarriages. 3 of them, across the years of the marriage, each one a grief that the public machinery of Kennedy life did not pause to accommodate. Ted's Senate career was accelerating. The family's political project was continuing. Joan appeared at the required events, retreated to manage her own losses in private, and returned again to stand at the requisite podiums and wave from the requisite motorcades. In 1969, Ted Kennedy drove off the Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, and a 28-year-old campaign worker named Mary Jo Kopech died. The incident, the accident, the delay in reporting it, the questions that were never fully answered. ended Ted's realistic presidential ambitions and generated a scandal that required, from the Kennedy image operation, an immediate and sustained response. Part of that response was Joan. She stood beside her husband at press conferences and public appearances in the weeks following Chappaquiddick, visibly pregnant with their third child. The imagery was calculated. Her presence was deployed as evidence of domestic normalcy, of a marriage intact, of a man who had the support of his family. She had been consulted, by accounts she later gave, only minimally about how her image would be used. She lost the pregnancy shortly afterward. There was one more moment still coming. A moment that would put Joan in front of the entire country in a way she had never been before. And it would cost her more than almost anything that had come before it. In 1979, Ted Kennedy announced he would challenge incumbent President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination. Joan, whose alcoholism had by this point become an open secret in Washington circles and had resulted in multiple treatment stays, was asked to be part of the campaign. She agreed. She has described the decision in terms of genuine motivation. She wanted to prove something, to herself and to others, about her capacity to function, to contribute, to be more than the problem the family quietly wished would resolve itself. She gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1980 that those who were present have consistently described as remarkable. She was composed, articulate, warm. She looked, by every external measure, like the woman she had always been trying to become. Ted lost the nomination. The marriage formally ended in divorce in 1982, after 24 years. Joan was 45 years old. She moved to Boston. She returned to her piano. She enrolled at the New England Conservatory of Music and completed a master's degree in music education in 1997, which is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary fact in this entire story. That the girl who had played piano at a Manhattanville fashion show and been absorbed into a dynasty found her way, eventually, back to the thing that had always been most purely hers. But the years between the divorce and that recovery were not linear. They were not a clean narrative of redemption. They were long and difficult, and frequently public in ways she had not chosen. Chapter 5. The Philosophical Climax and Aftermath. There is a version of Joan Kennedy's story that the culture has always preferred. In that version, she is a cautionary figure. The beautiful woman who couldn't handle the pressure, who drank too much, who wasn't strong enough for the life she'd chosen. It is a version that places the responsibility entirely within Joan herself, that treats her struggle as a personal failing rather than a structural outcome. That version is not only wrong, it is a continuation of the same erasure that damaged her in the first place. The tragedy was not who she was. The tragedy was how rarely the world around her made room for who she actually was. The Kennedys were called American royalty. And like actual royalty throughout history, the court around them had its casualties. People who were consumed by the machinery of the family's ambition and image, without the machinery ever pausing to acknowledge what it had consumed. Joan arrived at that court at 22, with a genuine interior life, a real artistic talent, and a sensitivity that was, in any honest accounting, among her finest qualities. The system took those qualities and found no use for them. It needed a surface, not a self. It needed a woman who could perform stability while living inside instability, who could smile at events while processing grief at home, who could be deployed as a visual argument for a marriage that was causing her sustained harm. She did all of that. For years. For decades. And then she was blamed for the ways it broke her. Joan Kennedy has lived, since the divorce, a life that has moved between difficulty and genuine recovery, between relapses and returns, in the way that lives shaped by addiction and trauma actually move. Not in straight lines, not in redemptive arcs that resolve cleanly in the third act, but in the complicated, nonlinear way of real human experience. She has given interviews of extraordinary candor. She has spoken about her alcoholism without self-pity and without deflection, with the directness of someone who has stopped performing and started simply telling the truth. She has played the piano. She is not, ultimately, a tragedy. She is a person who survived a set of circumstances that were specifically designed, by culture and by family, and by the particular brutality of the era she inhabited, to prevent her from knowing who she was. The question the photograph keeps asking, the one with the smile that never quite reaches her eyes, is not what was wrong with Joan Kennedy. The question is what kind of world looks at a woman like that and sees only the smile, and calls it enough, and moves on. We have the answer. It was the same world we built. And the least we can do from this distance is tell her story honestly. If this kind of history matters to you, the history of the people standing at the edge of the frame, subscribe. There are more stories like this one. There are more photographs worth studying. We'll be here.